Hi, everybody. This is the third week of MPA 660. And like I did last week and the week before, I just want to give you a few notes on the Kettle text just to sort of guide your reading. This does not take the place of your reading, as you'll see, but it does really give you some things to think about. So please do watch this and use it to help you as you navigate the reading. I showed you a slide like this last week where we compared where Kettle actually compared these theories of public administration, these ideas about how public administration works. And you recall he used the Wilsonian model, the Madisonian model, the Hamiltonian model, and the Jeffersonian model. And these are named basically for these individuals and the ideas that they had about government and about administration. And so last week we talked about these administrative concepts. This week, following Kittle, we want to talk about some administrative dilemmas, as he terms them, because um, these theories, these concepts, don't necessarily work out as planned. And so let's talk about that a little bit in the next 10 minutes or so. So I showed you this last week as well, and under a perfect kind of Wilsonian world, um, this is how we would link legitimacy on the left side there and accountability on the right side there. And in Wilson's way of thinking, this is how government should work, right? So uh, people are sovereign by natural law, and when they form constitutions, they legitimize the formation of government through elections, and not just through elections, but also through appointment. Um, Elected officials are legitimized to make policy. Administrators, who are typically appointed officials, not elected, carry out a policy in a neutral manner, according to Wilson. And we ask the question, is he correct? And in Wilson's mind, the best model was business. Um, the question is business always the best model? But if we take Wilson at his word, then accountability flows back up the chain, back to the people. And so in his perfect world, this is how legitimacy and accountability would link up. But again, there's a bit of a dilemma here, and we'll get to this in a second. And so the overarching question in chapter 3 of Kettle is there overall public administration theory? And he mentions really briefly in about one paragraph, he gives the example of microeconomics, which if you've taken much economics, there is an explicit theory of efficiency in microeconomics, which is that inherently markets are efficient. That is, in a supply and demand system, the price always reaches some equilibrium point between supply and demand. And that individuals are always modeled as people who maximize their own utility. And so individuals have perfect information, they have an ordered set of preferences, and they are seeking to maximize their utility. And these supposedly combine to produce the single best approach to problem solving. But of course, and this is my personal aside, micro or macroeconomics doesn't necessarily behave as predictably as all that. You might want to look into behavioral economics, which really is fairly new, but is devoted to trying to explain why people act sometimes against the utility maximizing model. On the other hand, public administration builds on recurring trade-offs, as Kettle mentions, that we have these trade-offs. For example, centralization versus decentralization, strong executives versus a separation of power system, federal control versus federalism. And we can think of other trade-offs as well, efficiency versus equity, for example. And so there is this whole set of trade-offs that pop up their heads in public administration that we have to resolve. And so how do we do that? Well, we start out by recognizing that these four theories of public administration, these four themes, really have some dilemmas built into them. And so what is, according to Kettle, the Wilsonian Dilemma? It is this question: how can we secure efficient and responsive public administration when there is not a chain of hierarchical authority linking policymakers with those who deliver public services? So recall that Wilson, what he envisioned was a professional administrative cadre, and these people were separated from politics, from the seamy side of politics, and their job was to carry out the policy directives of the elected officials. And so the policymakers themselves, the elected officials, could actually hold these public administrators accountable. But of course, the dilemma is it doesn't always work this way. It sometimes does, it often does, but it doesn't, especially in the late 20th century and beyond, because governments, and governments is a plural there, rely on various tools that sometimes bypass these vertical bureaucracies. So for example, grants, contracts, loans, regulations. Think of grants to local governments from the federal government. Think of contracting out governmental functions, and this is done at the national level, at state levels, at local levels. Think of using regulations that these regulations kind of become part of private industry processes. So you go buy a new car and you look on the windshield sticker for the price, and you also look for the mileage estimate. Well, that mileage estimate is really based on EPA regulations about how many miles per gallon that fleet of cars should get. So the fleet of Toyota cars or the fleet of Ford cars are supposed to achieve a certain MPG. And so that's what that's all about. And that has actually become part of the automobile manufacturing process. But then there's other things that governments do in addition to direct government. And Kittle mentions this guy, Lester Salomon, and his work is illustrative. And I'd like to show you a chart from his 2002 book. And so Salomon wrote this book in 2002 called The Tools of Government. And in this, he talks about how governments deliver services. This particular chart happens to depict the federal government activity by these tools in 1999. So it's getting a little dated, but it's really still pretty accurate. So you notice there's direct government and then indirect government. Well, direct government is the government actually delivering goods and services. And sometimes that good or service could be a check. So for example, a Social Security check to a recipient. Well, as it turns out, that the federal government does administer Social Security and does cut the checks or place them in people's checking accounts. So that's direct government. And so you see that according to Salomon's research, total direct government in 1999, if you look at that right-hand column, accounted for about 28% of the expenditures of the federal government, while indirect government accounted for about almost 72% of the expenditures of the federal government. Well, how can that be? Well, again, look at the lower part of this chart. We have tools like contracting, grants, vouchers, tax expenditures, which, for example, the homeowner interest tax deduction is a tax expenditure, loan guarantees, things like student loans, deposit insurance, that the FDIC insures depositors in banks. But that if that ever actually they had to deliver that, it would be delivered through the bank. Regulations, which I mentioned just a second ago. So the fact of the matter is that for the federal government, a lot of what people think of as government services are actually delivered through other vehicles and are sometimes administered by the public, by people in the nonprofit sector, people in the for-profit sector. So let's move on. The Jeffersonian Dilemma. Remember, Jefferson had this affinity for kind of this agrarian state. And so the dilemma is, how can we secure efficient and responsive government in an era when the federal government devolves so much responsibility to state and local governments and at the same time finds itself swept along by broader globalizing trends? Is it possible to secure accountability when there's no locus for accountability and where responsibility is spread across the political landscape? Well, what's interesting about Kittle mentioning this is, contrary to popular belief that the federal government has taken over so many functions that are done by the state, the fact of the matter is a lot of programs are really shared responsibility. Medicaid is one of the best known examples. Um, Medicaid has federal funding, Medicaid has state funding. So whatever state you live in, there is a portion of Medicaid that is paid for by the federal government and a portion of Medicaid that's paid for by the state government. And that is specifically why Medicaid benefits do tend to vary somewhat state to state. Housing assistance. So the classic public housing or Section 8 housing, which is rent assistance, is in fact a federal program, except that it's administered by local housing agencies. Those local housing agencies are actually, the people that work in them are appointed and hired by states or cities. Welfare programs, unemployment insurance. So if a person collects unemployment insurance, they go to a state office to do that. But that program is actually part of the Social Security law. National Guards, as a person with a military background, one of my favorite examples, every state has an Army National Guard and typically an Air National Guard, and you will see them, they deploy actually to war zones, but you'll also see them, working flood control, sometimes supplementing firefighters for rangeland fires and things like that. And they are actually under the command and control of that state governor. But the fact of the matter is, about 90% of the funding and most of the equipment is paid for by the U.S. Army or the U.S. Air Force. Highway funding is a great example where all highways in all states, the funding is shared between the Federal Highway Trust Fund and state funding. And we talked about healthcare last week, but the way the Affordable Care Act was designed to operate was that every state would own and operate an insurance exchange. That was the original design of that law. And so it was a federal program, but it was administered by the states. And so at the same time, as Kettle mentions, we have this globalized economy. He doesn't dwell on it too much, but what he's talking about is, our federal government effectively surrenders some sovereignty, and most countries do, whether they claim that they are or they aren't. But this affects governance and commerce. So think of things like international banking and the movement of money. There are trillions of dollars moving globally all the time, every day. Things like fishing protocols, things like environmental protocols, the movement of raw materials and finished goods. And I would actually, you can Google this. There's a show on NPR called Planet Money. It's really entertaining. It's a really entertaining, easy to understand show about economics. Google their video called Planet Money Makes a T-shirt. You'll learn a lot about how the clothing items you wear and I wear, the journey they take all over the world. So let's move on to the Hamiltonian Dilemma. And Kettle says the Hamiltonian Dilemma is, how can we secure efficient and responsive government when government is only one player among many? And no matter how efficient and responsive government might be, how can it solve problems it cannot control? So Hamilton, as you recall, really he was generally in favor of a stronger central government, but his vision really didn't materialize until the late 1800s and the 1900s. But Hamilton would not anticipate the volume of non-governmental partners where a strong executive, which he believed in, was not the locus of control. So, for example, since we discussed healthcare last week again, one of the things we really need to recognize about our national healthcare system, and that's why I gave you some of the resources to look at about costs, our healthcare system has evolved since about the 1930s. Um, and it is a hybrid. It's a mix where governments, and that is in the plural, meaning, state governments, the federal government, local governments, insurance companies, hospitals, healthcare organizations, pharmaceutical companies, professional organizations like the American Medical Association or AMA, all these players share power and they share influence in the cost and delivery of healthcare. And so it is really hard for us, as we discussed, and we had a really very vibrant discussion last week, but it is really hard to pin down healthcare and what kind of healthcare system it is. The word hybrid is really an apt description of our healthcare system, but because that's the case, it's sometimes difficult to really say, well, who's in charge? Is the federal government in charge? State governments? Is Medicare the kind of the king insurance company? Um, you know, are there other ways of looking at it? And I didn't even mention in here things like government directly provided healthcare, as in the military or the VA. So this is a really good example of the Hamiltonian dilemma. And so finally, the Madisonian dilemma. Madison was the one who said that ambition should be made to counteract ambition in the Federalist Papers. And so the dilemma is, how can we secure efficient and responsive public administration, which presumes clear lines of authority when the constitutional separation of powers system diffuses responsibility? Who's in charge when no one is in charge or everyone is in charge? So you know that at the national level and at every state level, we have a separation of power system, and that carries over into many of our cities, where we have a legislative, an executive, and a judicial, but particularly the legislative and the executive working together, or not working together sometimes, what that really means is no decision is truly final. The cooperation and conflict between branches it's really baked into the process, no matter what process you're talking about. So who's responsible and accountable for the budget every year? The president submits a budget. Congress actually comes up with a budget. This happens at state level too. At the end of the day, if people are angry about the budget, who are they going to blame? They're going to blame the president or the governor? They're going to blame the Congress or the state legislature. The fact of the matter is the blame can point both directions. And so we as administrators, it's difficult for us sometimes to navigate this dance really between branches of government. And Kettle mentions that unitary systems, that is a system where there's a prime minister who's the leader of the party, and the legislature, the parliament, if you will, is in that majority party, have a much less difficult time linking policy and administration. That is because unitary systems, or what are called Westminster systems, don't have separation of power. They're still democracy, they just don't have separation of power. Okay, so this is the last thing I want to throw out there. This is on, I think, page 59 of the text, and use these questions that Kettle throws out there really to guide your reading through the rest of the chapter. He calls it the fuzzy boundary problem. So with those dilemmas in mind, what you can see is that we have boundaries in administration, but they're not clear red line boundaries, are they? So he mentioned 6 boundaries that are fuzzy. Policy making versus policy execution. So the question is, can we figure out where one ends and the other begins? Public versus private versus nonprofit sectors. And when responsibility is shared, when the out for results is shared, then who's really accountable? Layers within bureaucracy. Where do responsibility and accountability reside in a bureaucracy? Layers between management and labor. How does the natural tension between management and labor affect programs? In the city where I live, Omaha, Nebraska, it's not atypical. There has been for a number of years disputes between management and labor on the number of firefighters that should be crewed on a fire truck. Should it be 4? Should it be 2? Should it be 3? But how does that affect firefighting? Connection between bureaucracies. How do managers sort out responsibilities? And then connection with citizens. So really the question is, are citizens customers? And if so, what kind of customer are they? And that's a really interesting portion of the chapter. So pay attention to that. And so that's it. That's my notes for this week. I used about 20 minutes of your time, but I hope that this helps you in your reading. Thanks a lot.